All right, hi everybody, John Meadows here, and today I want to talk about strength. We're here at the gym, we're here at American Barbell. Specifically, I want to talk about 5 reasons why you may not be getting stronger, training related, okay? So of course, if you're not eating, if you're not sleeping, if you're stressed out, of course those things can impact you. But I want to really deal more with the training aspect. So before I get into it, you know I like to tell stories. So I want to take you back to 1991-ish, 92-ish. I was 19, 20 years old. I started training at World Gym on East Livingston, which now is a bingo place, if you saw my stories from like a year ago. But it was the gym to be at. It's where all the bodybuilders and powerlifters trained at here in Columbus. And as I trained there, I began to notice things. So the powerlifters were, you know, they were all doing, the maximum they were doing rep-wise was like sets of 5. It was the old 5 sets of 5, right? So a lot of those guys were doing doubles, triples, sets of 5. And then there were a lot of bodybuilders that were doing their 8s, their 10s, their 12s. And then I went over to Westside Barbell in about 94, so a few years later, and I saw the best powerlifters in the world training with the best coach in the world. And a lot of those guys were doing their doubles or triples. You know, sometimes they're doing dynamic work, which was lighter. Sometimes they're doing maximal strength work, which was heavy. But they generally kept the reps pretty low. But there were some guys who were doing accessory work that were typically doing more reps. Chuck Vogelpool was one of them. So one of the things I noticed anecdotally was, you know, these guys that are doing the 2s, the 3s, the 4s are really strong, but they're not necessarily the biggest guys. Now the guys that were doing the 5s, really kind of the 6s and up, 6s, 8s, 10s, 12s, now those guys tended to be a lot bigger. Yeah, they were strong, but they were a lot bigger. They looked like bodybuilders. Chuck was a prime example of that. So, you know, I started wondering, it seems like there's this rep range for strength that seems to be below 5 reps and below. And for bodybuilding, it seems to be 6 reps and above to some threshold. And I just remember thinking that. And if you follow research, there's a guy named Chris Beardsley who's done a nice job. And he's talked about effective reps. And this is something he started talking about, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. But he talks about how many reps do you need to create enough mechanical tension to actually grow. He's looking at it from a bodybuilding perspective. And Chris came up with this idea that you need 5 hard reps or more, which I thought was interesting because I thought, man, that's an interesting number because I've always felt like 5 and below was geared more towards strength and 6 and above was geared more toward bodybuilding. That's what my experience taught me. I didn't have any studies to back that up. That's just what I observed over the years. So Chris was doing this research. I thought it was pretty cool, but that leads me to number 1 on our list, which is, the scary thing is that's my neat handwriting. Rep ranges. Your rep ranges might not be the best for strength. Now, this video is talking about strength, okay? So if you're training like a bodybuilder, you're doing 8s and 10s and 12s, you may not be getting the most strength gains that you can get. So now this is where it gets tricky. This is where you have to be able to program. What I am saying is you need to do your 2s, your 3s, your 4s, and your 5s to get maximal strength. Now, some of you will say, but I can get bigger if I was doing the higher reps, and more cross-sectional size in a muscle fiber, a bigger muscle fiber means it can produce more force. And you're right, eventually that can happen over enough time. Eventually you get bigger and eventually you can produce more strength. But I'm talking, boom, training effect, short term. Here's the tricky part. If you're doing the 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, you gotta be really careful with wear and tear on your joints. I've seen some more research from a friend of mine, Brad Schoenfeld. He's talked about doing sets of 3 versus sets of like 8 or 10 or 15. And the gains were kind of similar, but I asked Brad, I said, when that was over, how did the guys doing sets of 3 feel? And he said they were wrecked, their joints are wrecked, which is consistent with what I would think. So you have to be pretty smart. You've got to program in the strength work, but you can't do it so often that you tear your body up, and you know you're going to need a good strength coach for that. So your rep ranges might not be the best for strength. Okay, so that's number one. Number two on the list is your training volume may not be right. Specifically, you might be doing too much volume. You know, there's a lot of research that people talk about where if you train with more volume, you get a little bigger. So sometimes I think people get excited about doing a lot of volume. And there is a time and a place for a little higher volumes, but you know what else happens with high volumes? Is you gotta be careful you don't overtrain. I personally think overtraining comes a lot from high volume, really, really high volume training, and also from people training before they're recovered. So they train a body part or a movement before they're recovered from the last one. I think if you do that over and over and over, you can get overtrained. But your volume may be too high. So let me talk about what I think a good powerlifting workout or strength workout might be versus hypertrophy. The strength workout, I look at kind of like an athlete. So when you have an athlete training for strength, you want perfect explosive reps. You don't want fatigue to set in. You don't want ugly reps. This is why cluster training in strength training in athletes is so effective. It's different than bodybuilding. Like if you see me do a bodybuilding video, hey, let's do a cluster set. I'll go real hard, I'll rest 20 seconds, I'll go real hard, I'll rest 20 seconds, and then I'll go to failure. And it's very fatiguing. It absolutely destroys muscle fibers. Great for bodybuilding, but if you see cluster training for athletes, it's different. It'll be like, okay, let's take a weight that we can do for 3 or 4, and let's just do 1 or 2 perfect reps. Let's rest, 1 or 2 perfect reps. So you're getting more reps, but they're perfect reps. You're not training fatigue. And that's kind of how strength training is too. So, you know, you don't want to do a grinder set where you barely get the weight over and over and over. Like that's going to create a lot of fatigue. So you got to be very careful. If you're doing those 3s and 4s and 5s, you got to be careful you're not doing set after set after set after set of that, or your body will just start to break down. Maybe get overtrained, maybe just have so much fatigue you find it hard to recover, but you got to kind of find the right amount of volume in order to train that way with that style. So be really careful your volumes are not crazy. And the other thing is you may have good volume for your compound movements, but then you may do so much excessive accessory movements, that's too much volume for you to recover from. So even that you gotta be careful. So anyways, careful with your volume, too much volume. I don't really see a too low amount of volume with strength or bodybuilding. I generally don't see that. Those guys don't even look like they lift weights normally, so they're probably not even competitive. So anyways, volume is number 2. Okay, number 3 is as simple as it gets, progressive overload. So in order for you to get stronger, you have to push your body to get stronger. You have to add a little weight to the bar, preferably on, you know, the compound movements if you can. So, you know, 5 pounds, 10 pounds to your bench, your squat, your deadlift. It's got to be programmed intelligently though. You know, I see people, well, I'm really strong today, so I'm going to go 30 pounds heavier. And then the next 2 weeks, they don't make any progress. In fact, they may go backwards. So what you see in bodybuilding, you'll see when people feel it, they go for it. And I actually encourage that. If you feel it, go for it. But in powerlifting, you got to be a little bit more methodical. In strength training, you got to be a little bit more methodical. Those planned increases, the little steps, add up over time. They add up really well. So it's as basic as it gets, right? So you just have to focus on adding a little bit at a time. Now, I personally would just rather you do that on the compound movements. The other movements that you're doing, that's great if you're adding weight and getting stronger. But on those, you know, a little bit of fatigue is fine. If you're going for, maybe you're training a sticking point, or maybe you're training for hypertrophy, that's cool. But make sure on those compound movements you have a strategic plan on how much you're adding to the bar every single week, and then have your deloads planned. So basically just have a plan. How am I going to get my lifts up? Okay, very simple. So very simple, but you can't have this conversation without talking about progressive overload. Okay, number 4 is exercise selection. If you're training for strength, I don't know that a concentration curl is going to really help you. You know, you just got to make sure you're using the right movements. Typically, that's your bread and butter movement. So, you know, you get a guy like me, and I'm rotating stuff all the time. And if my goal was strength training, you could look at my training and you could say John doesn't know what he's doing, and you'd be exactly right. because my training is not geared towards strength. But if your training is geared towards strength, you really have to focus on those compound movements. Now, it gets a little tricky, and it's going to lead into my last point, number 5, but you can't neglect the benches, the incline benches, the pin presses. You can't neglect all those basics. Now, here's the second part of this. Of course, you got to do compound movements. But in your lifts, you usually have a sticking point, right? So let's say we're talking about a bench press. Your weakness might be your lockout. So if you're just sitting there doing tons of tricep press downs, thinking I'm going to get my triceps stronger, maybe they will, maybe they wouldn't. But what I would encourage you to do is I would encourage you to do like a pin press, which I mentioned earlier, that specifically trains the lockout. That might give you more bang for your buck strength-wise. So it's proper exercise selection. Let's say you're squatting. Let's say your lower back's a problem. Maybe you squat with a low bar and your quads and your legs are stronger than your lower back. Maybe you want to do like Louis had us do. Maybe you want to do a bunch of reverse hypers and really strengthen your spinal erectors. So that's the other piece of this. It's the right exercise selection. I think you guys all know this. The benches, the squats, the deadlifts. But there's a secondary piece of this, which is what are your sticking points, and are the exercises you're doing going to enable you to beat those sticking points? That's why I love things like pin presses and things like that, because they translate directly into those power lifts. And if you look at Dave Tate or any of these elite powerlifters, that's what Dave is an expert in. Dave can analyze your movement, and he can say, okay, this is weak, this is holding you back. Let's figure out how to get that strong. That's a much different approach than, I think I need stronger triceps, so I'm just going to do a bunch of push downs. May help you, maybe not. So that to me, this is probably my favorite one of all these, because I just love thinking exercise selection anyway. I love thinking about this. What is my weakness? Diagnose it. And you may need to get a real smart coach to figure out where your weakness actually is. And then what's my plan? How can I incorporate more weakness training into my plan to overcome that? So this is my favorite one, number 4. So exercise selection, number 4.
Hello, my name is Alexander Meadows, and today I'm going to be doing some outside loops.
Okay, and number 5, the last one, is frequency. I hear all these stories about guys squatting every day or benching 3 or 4 times a week. And this high frequency stuff tends to be pretty popular nowadays. A lot of that research is on bodybuilding though. It's stimulating the muscle, letting it recover, and stimulating it again. All right, so frequency, you gotta be really careful, because what have we been talking about? We've said on progressive overload to use basic movements. We've said on exercise selection, use basic movements. Those basic movements tend to also be the hardest on connective tissue. So, bench press is hard on your pec insertions, deadlifting and squatting, depending on your form and your structure, could potentially be really hard on your lower back. So when you start undergoing that stress, say you're training your bench press on Monday, if you come back on Thursday or Friday and you go heavy again and you keep doing that, normally what I see is injuries, plain and simple. And in the bodybuilding world, the guys that I see benching heavy every week, usually they have an injury. I'm not going to say always, but usually they have an injury. They don't know how to differentiate risk versus reward. So be really careful with your frequency. And even just in general training, here's what I want you to remember. When someone asks you, or if you think to yourself, when should I train the muscle again, or the movement again, it's when you're recovered. So if you're not recovered, don't train it again. If your joints don't feel quite right, unless you're old like me, then sometimes you just got to do the best with what you got. But if your muscles aren't recovered, if they're still sore, if your legs are sore, and it's squat day, man, you're in trouble. A damaged muscle fiber cannot produce as much force. We've seen that from Brad Schoenfeld's work, from Chris Beardsley's work. So you're not even going to be performing optimally, first of all. And then connective tissue is a little trickier. But when I used to bench press a lot, I used to notice the tendon right here was really sore all the time when I benched first. And guess what happened? I almost tore my pec so many times, probably 20 or 30 times. So be really careful with your frequency. I know the guides say do X amount a week, but use your head, okay? I want you all to think, am I recovered? If I'm not recovered, I gotta back it up a day. So I think if you follow these 5, you'll be able, and this is all logical thinking. This is really logical. I think if you can put together this logically and use common sense, I think your strength will get going. And again, there's other things, your diet, your rest, enough sleep. Of course, there's all that stuff, but this is the training stuff that will get you the most bang for your buck right here. So thanks a bunch for watching. I hope this helps. If you have any more comments, comment below, and we'll see you next time.